Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for December 10th, 2025. Today we're going to be talking about why we still need NATO, or do we still need NATO? There's been a lot of discussion of this in the wake of the release of the National Security Study for 2025, which raises the whole question of, is there a need for NATO? And it's led to a tremendous backlash from Europe. The same people who refused to fund NATO when during President Trump's first term he called on an increase in funding from Europe are now insisting that NATO is the only thing that protects Europe from a Russian invasion. And so you have an emerging break, a significant break between the United States and Europe. And I want to take a look at the history of this, because the whole question is, do we need NATO, or is it just a relic of the Cold War? Now, think back to February 25th, 1991. That was the day that there was a meeting in Hungary which decided to dismantle the Warsaw Pact. And this followed a whole series of meetings after the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989. So let's just think about what went on at some of these meetings. There were discussions that probably the most important was on February 9th, 1990, when U.S. Secretary of State James Baker pledged that there would be no NATO expansion, not 1 inch eastward. Now, that was taken by the Russians as a pledge that they should honor and they should trust, because the issue was the reunification of Germany, that the removal of Russian troops, the end of the Warsaw Pact. If Russia would accept that, what would be the return? And the return from Baker was a promise not to expand NATO to the east. And so that paved the way for the peaceful reunification of Germany, which was consolidated on October 3rd, 1990. Now, that then was followed up by a whole series of events, including the February 25th, 1991 meeting that agreed to peacefully dissolve the Warsaw Pact. Now, the Warsaw Pact was the Soviet-directed counter to NATO. The Warsaw Pact was set up in 1955 as a collective defense treaty, which at times had as many as 250,000 to 500,000 troops stationed in Eastern Europe, coordinated under Moscow's leadership. Now, this was in response to the concern they had with NATO. And there were reasons for this. For example, there was a very near confrontation, war almost, in October 1961, where the American tanks and Russian tanks squared off against each other in Berlin at Checkpoint Charlie. Shortly after that, the Berlin Wall was built, and the division of Europe was more concrete than ever, concrete in the sense that you had a wall between them. Now, this continued in an unstable, often confrontational way up through the late 70s, when you had a deployment of Russian missiles, Soviet missiles in East Germany, the SS-20s, and the U.S. response, the Pershing missiles in West Germany. And, well, this looked like it could lead to an extremely dangerous confrontation. There were negotiations, including especially between Reagan and Soviet President Gorbachev, which led to some of the arms control agreements, which have now since expired. Now, the whole question came up during that period of what's going to happen with the Warsaw Pact. And when the Berlin Wall fell, the decision was made to peacefully dissolve it. And that created a potential for a Western positive response toward developments in Russia. But instead, what was the response from the West? expansion of NATO throughout Eastern Europe, and it continues with the attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO. And secondly, the shock therapy policy of the 90s, which nearly destroyed Russia, not the Soviet Union, which had already been dissolved, but destroyed Russia. It created a demographic crisis in Russia, which brought Putin to power to try to address the problems. Now, if you think about this history, the question then is, what would be the role of NATO after the breakup of the Warsaw Pact? There was no role. If NATO was truly a defensive policy and the threat was eliminated, why do you need NATO? Now, we hear the Macrons and Starmers and Merzes today saying that Russia's still a threat, Putin's still a threat. He had no provocation for invading Ukraine. Well, they know that's not true. There were provocations throughout this whole period, including the regime change coup in Ukraine in the Maidan Square, which put into power in Kiev an anti-Russian regime, first under Poroshenko, then under Zelensky. So the idea that there was no provocation, it's a typical lie coming from the West. But more importantly, you had in this whole period between 1990 and the present, a move toward global NATO. NATO troops participated in the attacks on Afghanistan, in Iraq and Libya. They were involved in Syria in some way and continue to be involved today with the threats coming from NATO leaders, ranging from the new Prime Minister of Japan, who's talking about confronting China over Taiwan, and also NATO leaders from France in particular, calling for deployment of British and even American nuclear weapons in Europe to counter the Russian threat. So the war language from NATO is forcing the Russians to reevaluate what they're going to do. Now, this brings us to the release of the National Security Strategy memo, just released a couple weeks ago. And what does it say? It basically says NATO has no role. The U.S. is not going to be involved with NATO. It doesn't go quite that far, but the Europeans see the handwriting on the wall, that NATO is an obsolete alliance with no purpose. And so they're trying to create a purpose, provoke a war with Russia. And this is where the danger is. The Europeans are insisting there's a Russian threat to Europe, that Ukraine is just the starting point, it's the appetizer, including they're licking their chops over Poland and Germany as well. But the only reason the Russians are even concerned about these Western countries is the threats coming from the West, including from people like Starmer, like NATO commanders talking about preemptive nuclear strike on Russia. And so the Russians have to pay attention to this. So the question now is, why keep NATO in existence? There's only one reason. It's an alliance to defend the unipolar order, which is the empire centered in the city of London, and which is in total opposition to the emergence of a new alliance of European countries, potential European countries, with Eurasia, which is typified now by the BRICS, by Russia and China and India alliance, and the fact that much of the global south is in support of this alliance against the Western powers. Now, it's not that they want to fight the Western powers, it's that they're defending their sovereignty. Who has attacked the sovereign nations in the world in the last 20 years? It's been NATO. It's been the US. It's been the Biden-Blinken team. And now Trump is saying we're not going to do that anymore. Tulsi Gabbard said the US will no longer carry out regime change. And this has Europe panicked. You can't say that. You have to continue to overthrow governments that are hostile to the International Monetary Fund and the bankers. No, you don't. You can reach agreements of mutual benefit. And that's what the Russians are doing with the Chinese, the Indians, the Indonesians, and others. And there are many other countries lining up to participate. So we're at a point where the dissolution of NATO is a strategic imperative. Now, the gnashing of teeth that you're hearing from Europe is the last gasp of the imperial faction, with no strategy for building up the European economy except military, rearmament, spending on weapons. And the war economy is the worst thing for the people of Europe. So the issue now is being pushed by Donald Trump. Now, how serious is Trump about ending NATO? Well, if you ask the White House, you get an ambiguous answer. Essentially, though, saying that NATO has tied our hands for years. But if you ask the Europeans, they're terrified that this is the end phase of NATO. And I would argue on behalf of the position of Helga Zepp-LaRouche, this should be the time to put NATO to bed, to end the NATO alliance before it launches World War III.